In the early 1960s, a group of drag racers had an idea that was equal parts brilliant and insane. They looked at surplus World War II aircraft engines, massive V-12 power plants that had once propelled fighters and bombers through the skies, and thought, what if we put those in a drag car? What followed was one of the strangest and most spectacular chapters in American motorsport history. Before this is over, we'll see engines producing power that nobody thought possible, races that bent the rules to the breaking point, and a governing body forced to intervene before the sport tore itself apart. So let's begin. But first, what exactly was drag racing in the early 60s, and why were these guys so desperate for more power? Now, to understand why anyone would shove an aircraft engine into a race car, you need to understand the state of drag racing at the time. This was still a relatively young sport. The NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, had only been around since 1951. Drag racing had grown out of illegal street racing, and by the early 60s, it was becoming something legitimate, something organized. But it was still the Wild West in a lot of ways. The basic premise was simple. Two cars line up, a light turns green, first one to the end of the quarter-mile wins. That's it. Pure acceleration, no turns, no strategy beyond building the fastest, most powerful machine you could manage and then holding on for dear life. And the thing is, drag racers had always been tinkerers. These were guys who loved to push boundaries, who spent their weekends in garages figuring out how to extract every last horsepower from whatever engine they could get their hands on. The culture rewarded innovation. If you found a new way to go faster, you were a hero, at least until someone else figured out how to go even faster. By the early 60s, the top fuel dragsters were already producing serious power. We're talking supercharged, nitromethane-burning monsters that could hit speeds that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. But there were limits. The engines they were using, big block V8s mostly, could only be pushed so far before they started coming apart. And in drag racing, the engine coming apart wasn't a figure of speech. These things exploded. Regularly. So here's the situation. You've got a bunch of competitive, mechanically minded guys who want more power than conventional engines can reliably produce. And then someone notices that you can buy surplus aircraft engines for almost nothing. I mention this because the timing matters here. The military had been selling off equipment from World War II and Korea for years by this point. Engines that had cost the government tens of thousands of dollars were going for pennies on the dollar at surplus auctions. And not just any engines, Allison V-1710s, Rolls-Royce Merlins, the same power plants that had won the war. These were engineering marvels designed to produce sustained power at high altitudes while remaining relatively reliable. In their military applications, they made anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 horsepower. Some later variants pushed even higher. Now, a drag racer looks at that and sees possibility. These engines were designed to run for hours at a time. A drag race lasts maybe 10 seconds. What happens if you tune one of these things for a 10-second burst instead of sustained flight? What if you overboost it? What if you run it on exotic fuels? The answer, as it turned out, was absolutely terrifying power. The first guys to try this were working in the late 50s and early 60s. The details get a bit murky. Like a lot of early drag racing history, records weren't always kept, and some of what we know comes from people's memories decades later. But by the early 60s, there were definitely aircraft engine dragsters showing up at strips around the country, and the results were immediate. These things were fast. Not just a little faster than the competition, dramatically, absurdly faster. Think about the math for a second. A top fuel dragster of the era might make 800 to 1,200 horsepower on a good day. An aircraft engine, even in relatively stock form, could match that. And these weren't running in stock form. The builders quickly figured out that these engines responded beautifully to supercharging. They were already designed to work with superchargers, most aircraft engines were, to compensate for thin air at altitude. So you bolt on a bigger blower, tune the fuel system, and suddenly you're making power that the engine's original designers never imagined. We're talking numbers that approached, and sometimes exceeded, 2,000 horsepower. In 1962, let that sink in for a moment. The average car on the road at the time made maybe 150 horsepower. A really hot muscle car might make 300. These aircraft engine dragsters were producing 6 or 7 times that. The spectacle alone was worth the price of admission. These engines were enormous. Some of them stretched 6 feet long. They sounded like nothing else at the drag strip. The deep, thunderous roar of a V12 at full power was completely different from the crackling bark of a supercharged V8. People who saw them run said you could feel it in your chest from the grandstands. But here's where things start to get complicated. See, drag racing has always had classes. The whole point of classes is to keep competition fair. You race against cars with similar capabilities, so skill and preparation matter more than just having the biggest checkbook. But these aircraft engines didn't fit neatly into any existing class structure. They were a completely different animal. Some racers ran them in exhibition classes, which was basically the anything goes category for weird and wonderful machines that didn't fit anywhere else. And for a while, that worked fine. The aircraft engine cars were crowd favorites. They were spectacular to watch, and since they weren't competing directly against conventional dragsters, nobody had anything to complain about. But then some guys started asking questions. Why should these be exhibition only? If the rules don't specifically ban them, shouldn't they be legal in competition classes? This is where things get interesting. Drag racing rules at the time were written around conventional automotive engines. Nobody had thought to specify no aircraft engines because, honestly, who would have thought you needed to? The rulebooks talked about displacement limits and engine configurations, but they were thinking about V8s and inline sixes, not 12-cylinder monsters designed to propel B-24 Liberators. So there was a period, and the records suggest this was mostly in the early to mid-60s, where some of these aircraft engine cars were competing in sanctioned events against conventional machines. And the results were predictable. They won. Not just won, dominated. Now put yourself in the shoes of a guy who spent years building and refining his top fuel dragster. You've got a small block Chevy that you've ported and polished yourself. You've experimented with different fuel mixtures. You've tweaked your supercharger setup until it's just right. You show up at the strip, and there's some guy with an Allison V12 producing twice your horsepower. How do you compete with that? You don't. That's the answer. You just don't. And this created a problem for the sport. Drag racing's appeal was partly built on the idea that a clever guy with limited resources could compete against better-funded teams through ingenuity and skill. That's the American dream in automotive form, right? But when someone shows up with an engine that's fundamentally superior to anything you can build, skill doesn't matter anymore. It's just a checkbook war, and the guy with the surplus aircraft engine wins. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of story. Quick question, where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do this every week. All right, back to the aircraft engines, because here's where the NHRA had to step in. The governing body was in a tough spot. On one hand, these aircraft engine cars were popular with spectators. They were exciting, they were loud, they were different. On the other hand, they were threatening to destroy competitive balance in the sport. There's a principle in motorsport that goes something like this. If you allow something that gives a massive advantage to anyone who can afford it, eventually the sport becomes about who has the most money rather than who's the best racer. And once that happens, the average guy loses interest. Why spend your weekends building and tuning a car when some millionaire is just going to buy his way to victory? The NHRA wrestled with this problem through the early 60s. There were debates, discussions, arguments at races, and in the pages of enthusiast magazines. Some people thought the aircraft engines should be banned entirely. Others argued that innovation was the soul of drag racing. If you banned one type of engine, where did you stop? But the practical reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The aircraft engine cars were simply too fast. They were creating a two-tier system where you either had an aircraft engine or you didn't stand a chance. And that wasn't what drag racing was supposed to be about, so the NHRA made a decision. They banned all aircraft engines from competition. Now, I want to be clear about what this means. This wasn't a gradual phase-out or a complicated technical regulation. This was a straightforward rule: no aircraft engines, period. If your engine was originally designed to power an airplane, it wasn't allowed in sanctioned NHRA competition. The response was mixed, as you might expect. Some people were relieved. The conventional dragster crowd could go back to competing on something like equal terms. Others were furious. They'd invested time and money into these aircraft engine builds, and now they were being told their cars were essentially illegal. There were protests and complaints. Some racers argued that the ban was anti-innovation, that the NHRA was punishing success instead of encouraging it, but the governing body held firm. The rules stuck. And here's the thing, looking back, it was probably the right call. See, drag racing in the 60s was at a crossroads. It could have gone one of two ways. It could have become a sport dominated by exotic, expensive, one-off machines that only wealthy teams could afford. Or it could remain a sport where someone with a garage, some tools, and a lot of determination could build a competitive car. The aircraft engine ban pushed the sport toward the second option. By forcing everyone back to conventional piston engines, the NHRA kept the playing field relatively level. Yes, some teams still had more money than others. Yes, some engines were better than others. But at least everyone was working within roughly the same framework. Now, I should mention that the ban didn't mean aircraft engine dragsters disappeared entirely. They continued to run in exhibition and at unsanctioned events for years. Some of them even got faster, as their builders continued to refine them. But they were no longer part of mainstream drag racing competition. The ban also had an interesting effect on innovation within conventional engine technology. With aircraft engines off the table, racers had to find other ways to make more power. This led to advances in supercharger design, fuel systems, and engine construction that might not have happened if everyone had just been dumping aircraft engines into their cars. In a weird way, the limitation forced creativity. If you can't just bolt in a bigger engine, you have to get smarter about how you extract power from the engine you've got. And the sport did progress. Through the 60s and into the 70s, top fuel dragsters kept getting faster, even without aircraft engines. The supercharged Hemi became the dominant power plant, and teams figured out how to make those things produce power that would have been science fiction just a few years earlier. By the 70s, top fuel cars were running in the 5-second range and hitting speeds over 250 miles per hour, all with engines that weren't fundamentally different from what you'd find in a road car. Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, a top fuel Hemi and a street Hemi share some basic DNA, but they're really not the same thing at all. A top fuel engine is basically a bomb that you're directing in one direction for about 4 seconds. They consume something like a gallon of nitromethane per second. They're rebuilt between every run. They make upwards of 10,000 horsepower in modern form. But my point is that this power came from refining conventional engine technology rather than importing something from outside the automotive world. And that probably made for a healthier sport in the long run. There's a broader lesson here about rules and innovation that applies way beyond drag racing. Any competitive endeavor has to balance two things: rewarding innovation and maintaining fair competition. Push too far in either direction, and you end up with problems. Too many restrictions, and you get a stagnant sport where nothing ever changes. But too few restrictions, and you get an arms race where whoever spends the most money wins. The trick is finding the sweet spot in the middle, allowing enough innovation to keep things interesting while preventing any single advantage from becoming overwhelming. The NHRA's aircraft engine ban was one way of managing that balance. It said, essentially, we want you to be clever and innovative, but within certain boundaries. Work with automotive engines. Figure out how to make those faster. Don't just import technology from a completely different world and call it racing. Now, was the ban controversial at the time? Absolutely. Did it disappoint some fans who loved watching those massive V12s thunder down the strip? Definitely. But it kept the sport accessible to a broader range of competitors, and that was probably worth the trade-off. The aircraft engine era remains one of those fascinating what-if moments in racing history. What if they hadn't been banned? Would drag racing have evolved into a sport of exotic, purpose-built machines like land-speed record cars? Would the Allison V12 have become the standard power plant for top fuel? Or would the escalation have continued until the cars became too dangerous or too expensive for anyone to run? We'll never know. The ban put a stop to that particular experiment, but for a few years there, in the early 60s, some racers got to experience what it felt like to harness aviation technology for a 10-second blast down a quarter-mile strip. By all accounts, it was absolutely insane. The guys who built and raced those machines were doing something genuinely new. They looked at available technology, saw an opportunity, and went for it. That spirit, that willingness to try something crazy because maybe, just maybe, it would work, is what made early drag racing special. And what of the aircraft engines themselves? Most of them ended up back in the hands of collectors or were scrapped for parts. A few probably still exist in garages and warehouses, relics of an era when anything seemed possible if you just had the guts to try it. The Allison V1710s and Rolls-Royce Merlins went back to being museum pieces and warbird restorations. Their brief career in drag racing, just a footnote in their long histories. The racers who ran them moved on, too. Some went back to conventional engines and kept competing. Others drifted away from the sport, either frustrated by the new rules or simply ready for something different. A few became legends, remembered for pushing boundaries even when the establishment pushed back. And the NHRA? It kept evolving, kept refining its rules, kept trying to balance innovation against fairness. The aircraft engine ban was just one of many decisions they'd make over the decades, each one shaping the sport in its own way. Some of those decisions were popular, some were controversial, but together they built the framework that turned drag racing from a bunch of guys racing on empty roads into a professional sport with millions of fans. That's the thing about rules in racing. Nobody likes them in the moment. They always seem to be holding back progress, preventing the fastest possible cars from running. But without them, there's no sport at all. Just a series of unrelated exhibitions where the richest team always wins. So yeah, the aircraft engine dragsters were spectacular. They were fast, they were loud, they were unlike anything that came before or since. And then they were gone, banned by a governing body that decided fair competition mattered more than absolute speed. And that is the story of drag racing's aircraft engine era. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. Drop a comment. Had you heard about these things before? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.